Chapter 37. Catherine was giddy when Jess's mysterious tower of stone deposited them into the crossroads, arms linked, faces flushed, and lungs full of laughter. Her hair was a tangled mess. Her toes were uncomfortably cold on her one bare foot, and Kath had not known before what happiness was. Her whole body was smiling. She felt that she could step off the checkered tile floor and fly up, up, up if she wasn't careful. They found the door to Rock Turtle Cove, and Jess opened it for her with an elaborate bow. "After you, my lady." She curtsied. "Why, thank you, good sir," she said, dancing through the door and out onto the riverbank. The bridge above them was sullen and quiet, the air still but for the chirping of crickets and the crackle of lightning bugs. Jess shut the door beneath the bridge and followed her up to the path. She felt the tender brush of his fingertips against her lower back, and the caress warmed her to her bones. She smiled back at him and saw her contentment reflected in his face. It only took the gentlest of tugs before she was in his arms again. No sooner had their lips touched than a warning caw darted down Catherine's spine. She gasped and swiveled her head, spotting Raven in the trees. Jess grabbed her elbow. "Kath." The night's tranquility erupted with the sound of clanging armor and shouted commands. Catherine cried out as Jess's hand was ripped away from her, leaving her skin burning. She tried in time to see the 2 and 7 of clubs forcing Jess onto his knees. A suite of palace guards spread out behind them, their clubs and javelins raised. "What are you doing?" she screamed, wrapping her hands around Jess's upper arm. The guards held firm. "Let him go!" "Catherine, oh, thanks to goodness!" She spun around. Her mother and father barreled out from behind a border of shrubs. The king, too, was there, and the sight of him made Kath's veins run cold, moments before her mother wrapped her in a suffocating embrace. "Oh, my sweet girl, my darling child, you're home, you're safe." "Of course I'm safe. What is the meaning of this?" "You needn't be frightened anymore." The Marchioness stroked her hair. "We heard all about the Jabberwock attack. Much as I adore His Majesty, I may never forgive his putting you in harm's way like that." She said this with an element of cheekiness, knowing His Majesty was standing not far away, and, of course, he was already forgiven. "They said you were injured, and this wicked joker had taken you to the Sturgeons. We went there, your father and Marianne and I, but you were nowhere to be seen, and no one had heard from you, and the Sturgeons said you hadn't been to see them. And all I could think was that you were helpless and afraid and hurt, and this awful man had secreted you away and was doing something vile and awful and—" She was sobbing, great big blubbering sobs that turned Kath's stomach with guilt. A loud honk drew her attention over her mother's shoulders. Her father was blowing his nose into a handkerchief, his eyes red and sleepless. She spotted Marianne and Abigail, too, loitering near the tree line. Both were pale and wide-eyed. Marianne looked revealed, her hands pressed against her stomach. "Did he—" Her mother swallowed hard. "Did he hurt you?" "What? No!" Kath shook her head as her mother's words pieced together. She disentangled herself from her mother's embrace. "He didn't. It was nothing like that. This is all a misunderstanding." She spun back to the guards. "Let him go. He hasn't done anything." "It's all right now," said her father, stepping forward to brush back a strand of Kath's hair. "He's captured now. You don't have to be afraid. His Majesty has ensured us this will never happen again." Aghast, Catherine peered down at Gest. His lips were pressed thin, the only sign of emotion on his face. All signs of their previous euphoria were gone. His gaze, now cunning and sly, was darting from the king to the guards to Raven, perched somewhere overhead. He wasn't looking at her, nor was he looking particularly innocent. Kath frowned and planted her hands on her hips. "You are overreacting. Gest was helping me. He took me..." She hesitated, but only for a moment. "He took me to the Trestle well. He knew where it was. And look, my leg is healed." She lifted the hem of her dress. "Catherine!" Her mother slapped her hand down, and the hem fell, but not before Marianne's hand had flown to her mouth. She had seen the damage at the theater. She knew the miracle of it. Kath dared to turn her focus on the king, her suitor. She gulped, but guilt over her mussed hair and swollen lips was barely a knot pestering at the back of her thoughts. "Your Majesty, please, you can't arrest him. He hasn't done anything wrong." The king ducked his chin between the folds of his cloak. The crown started to slip on his head. "Nothing wrong," her mother barked, fluttering her arms. "He kidnapped you! Twice!" Catherine's breath snagged. "I can't imagine what spell this man has on you," her mother continued. "But to steal you away, once, directly from beneath the nose of your betrothed?" "He's not my betrothed." "And even from our own house, your own chambers," she wailed. She was crying again. Catherine's father scooped her into his arms, but she pushed him away, turning her wrath on Gest, who was still on his knees, held firm by the guards. "You wretch! You villain! How dare you!" Gest held her gaze, his jaw twitching, his expression unreadable. "Mama, stop it!" Catherine clung to her arm. "It isn't like that! He..." Her thoughts skidded to a stop. Her parents knew. They knew he'd come to her chambers. They knew they'd sneaked away in the middle of the night. Her eyes drifted back to Marianne, chest aching with betrayal. Marianne stared back, her eyes watering and hands clasped. "I'm sorry," she mouthed. "We were expecting a demand for ransom," her father said, his voice gruff. "We didn't know if we would ever see you again." "Yet here I am," Kath said, still reeling. "Not kidnapped, not ransomed. I can explain everything." "He stole you away from this very house," her father bellowed. "Unchaperoned, anything could have happened." "But nothing did happen." "You mean to tell me..." His voice had darkened. He was an ocean storm gathering on the horizon. "That my daughter, my angel, went with him willingly?" Her cheeks flamed. Father!" "Did my daughter..." He continued speaking as if every word were a stray. "Sneak out of my house in the middle of the night, alone, with the court joker, and attend a gathering of strangers and ruffians, and who knows what sorts of creatures?" Her ribs collapsed inward, pushing the air from her lungs. How many of her secrets had Marianne told? This was her last chance, she knew, to deny it all, to blame Gest for everything, to pass the consequences onto his shoulders, to maintain her parents' perception of her forever. She swallowed down the knowledge of how easy it would be, and how impossible. No, she could not betray him. She squeezed her fists and opened her mouth, but it was a deeper voice than spoke. No. They all spun to jest. His chin was high, but his eyes downcast. He didn't look at Kath, or her parents, or the king. She did not come with me willingly, though she might think it. Her pulse sputtered. Jest! The chattering insects had silenced, and for a moment there was only the burble of the creek behind them. Jest looked up and met her stunned expression with something dark and determined. I used a charm to persuade her to come with me. It was a trick. He's lying! That isn't... Lady Pinkerton is innocent. She is not at fault for anything that's happened. The Marchioness wilted with relief and gratitude, her faith in all the world restored. But why? Stammered the king, his voice a squeak in the darkness. Kath could never recall seeing him so distraught, so unhappy, and the look of betrayal gave her a sharp sting of guilt. Why would you do it, Jest? Why would you do it, Jest? Jest fixed his eyes on the king, expressionless. My loyalty belongs to the White King and Queen of Chess. I was sent to steal the heart of your queen and bring it back. I have been trying to woo her, so that her heart would be mine to take once you were married. The king stumbled back, a hand over his chest, as if Jest had stabbed him. How could you do such a thing to Lady Pinkerton? Kath tensed. Jest, don't! Hold your tongue, daughter of mine. Her father's firm hand landed on her shoulder. It's clear that he still has you under some enchantment. Jest's gaze skipped to her. It's true. I have been using every skill at my disposal to mesmerize her. Goosebumps swept across her skin. He had her heart, and she had his. Nothing could change that. Nothing. But he was making himself a villain to her parents, to the king, to all of hearts. And what for? To save a reputation she cared less for by the minute? Her mother nodded. You see, he has confessed his crimes, with us all here to witness it. What fortune that we discovered this now before it could go any further. Thank heavens Marianne came to her senses and thought to ask for help. Catherine's insides writhed. Her eyes began to well with tears, but she blinked them back and turned to look at Marianne again. Her lifelong friend stood beneath a copse of trees, looking stricken and so very, very sorry. A hard knot of anger tightened in the base of Catherine's stomach. Following the look, her mother waved her hand at the maids. Abigail, Marianne, go back to the house and draw a warm bath for Catherine. She has been through quite an ordeal tonight. They dropped into fast curtsies. I'm so glad you're all right, Lady Catherine, Marianne said, her voice barely a breath before she followed Abigail toward the house. Kath's anger twitched and grew. She was not right at all. I trust the criminal will be taken to a prison cell, said the Marquess. He had better, said the Marchioness. Some of her spittle landed on Jest's cheek, but he barely twitched. For the safety of our daughter. I don't want him to be able to ensorcel anyone but prison rats from this day forward. Of course, stammered the king, forcing himself into their circle. He was wringing his hands, and Kath could see he was desperate to have this whole situation behind him. I cannot begin to convey my remorse for all that's happened. His eyebrows bunched in the middle of his brow as he gestured toward Jest. He just seemed so trustworthy, Kath sneered. You are all idiots! Catherine, her mother snapped. The Marquess placed an arm around his wife's shoulders. Now, dearest, she is not herself, can't you see? Catherine crossed her arms over her chest. Then who do you think I am? Well, the king cleared his throat, changing the subject. The joker will be, dealt with. He tugged his collar away from his throat. And then we shall forget any of this unpleasantness ever happened. Cath turned to Geste. He held the look, and there was something insistent in his gaze. Maybe he was telling her this was all for the best, but she refused to believe it. Suddenly, the king started clapping, an impulsive, anxious sound. Oh, yes, that's what we'll do. Let's have a party. Catherine's attention swiveled back to him. A party? You were right what you said at the theater, my sweet, said the king, and Catherine cringed. I am the king, and I must do something to make the people of Hearts feel safer. None of this jabberwock and kidnapping nonsense. We'll have a great masquerade, and then we'll all dance and eat and be quite merry. And we'll forget anything bad has ever happened. Ever. This is a terrible idea, Cath screeched. Don't you remember? The Jabberwock attacked the last party you... Her anger was muffled by her mother's hand slapped over her mouth. Brilliant, Your Majesty, positively brilliant. The king bounced on his toes, pleased with her approval. Tomorrow night then, and... He grew suddenly bashful, his cheeks reddening behind his curled mustache. And perhaps I shall have a special announcement to make. He waggled his eyebrows at Catherine, and if she hadn't been caught in her mother's firm grip, she would have screamed. Now then, the king chirped. Back to the castle we go. Bring the prisoner. That's all right, then. Uppity up! The guards had begun to move into formation when Geste cleared his throat. Actually, Your Majesty, if I might say one more thing. The clearing quieted. All eyes drifted to Geste. Wary, except for Cath, who was panicked and hopeful. Any spite he'd had before was missing from his expression. All signs of discontent gone. He smiled at the king with an abundance of charm and said, You had been good to me, Your Majesty. The king's chest lifted, and he tugged on the fur trim of his cloak. Oh, why, thank you, Geste. Which is why it pains me to have betrayed you so, and to now betray you again. His yellow gaze found Cath, brimming with unspoken words. Geste's body dissolved, a shadow, a flutter, a wisp of ink-dipped quills. Raven cawed and dropped down from the trees, and two identical blackbirds stole away into the night.